maybe a little long, but worth it. This is Jack Hitt from that I heard on public radio, a story. So he says, "It all began at Christmas 2 years ago when my daughter was 4 years old. And it was the first time she had ever asked about what did the holiday mean. And so I explained to her that this was celebrating the birth of Jesus, and she wanted to know more about it. And we went out and we bought a kid's Bible and had these readings at night, and she loved them, wanted to know everything about Jesus. So we read a lot about his birth and about his teaching, and she would constantly ask what that phrase was, and I would explain to her, 'Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.' And we would talk about those old words and what it all means. And then one day we're driving past a church, and out front was an enormous crucifix. And excitedly she says, like, 'Who's that?' And I guess I realized I never told that part of the story. So I had that sort of like, yeah, oh, that's Jesus, right? And I forgot to tell you the ending. Well, you know, he ran afoul of the Roman government. The message that he had was so radical and unnerving that the prevailing authorities of the time, they thought they had to kill him. They came to the conclusion he'd have to die, that his message was too troublesome. It was about a month later, after that Christmas, we'd gone through the whole story of what Christmas meant. Yeah. And it was mid-January, and her preschool celebrates the same holidays as the local schools. So Martin Luther King Day was off. And so I knocked off work early that day and decided we'd play, and I took her out for lunch. And we're sitting there, and right on the table where we happened to plop down was the art section of the local newspaper. And there, big as life, was a huge drawing by like a 10-year-old kid from the local schools of Martin Luther King. And she said, "Who's that?" And I said, well, as it happens, that's Martin Luther King. And he's why you're not in school today, because we're celebrating his birthday. This is the day we celebrate his life. And she said, "So who was he?" And I said, "Well, he was a preacher." And she looks up at me and says, "For Jesus?" And I said, yeah, actually he was. But there was another thing he was really famous for, which is that he had a message. And you're trying to say this to a 4-year-old. It's this is the first time they hear anything. So you just are very careful about how you phrase everything. So I said, well, he was a preacher, and he had a message. And she said, "What was his message?" And I said, "Well, he said that you should treat everybody the same no matter what they look like." And she thought about that for a minute. And she said, "Well, that's what Jesus said." And I said, "Yeah, I guess it is." I never thought of it that way, but yeah. And that is sort of like, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And she thought about it for a minute and looked up at me and said, "Did they kill him too?"